Next year is projected to be the largest tax refund season ever. And we're going to be giving back refunds out of the tariffs because we've taken in literally trillions of dollars. And we're going to be giving a nice dividend to the people, in addition to reducing debt. We, as you know, I inherited a lot of debt, but it's peanuts compared to the kind of numbers we're talking about. So we're going to be making a dividend to the people. And additionally, we're going to...
The world was stunned when news leaked of a secret meeting between the US, China, and Africa, three powers that were never supposed to sit at the same table as equals. For decades, Washington dictated global terms, Beijing challenged them, and Africa was expected to simply choose a side. But this time, everything flipped, and the US walked into the room, not as a dominant force, but as a nation scrambling to stop its own decline.
The president of Kenya. We have the Olympics here. You know, they do very well in the Olympics, those runners. I don't know what the heck you do with those runners, but they are very good. I've been watching them for a long time. So we have the Olympics coming to the United States. You know that. Thank you very much. And you'll come as our guest. Thank you. And the president of the Council of Ministers of Togo. Thank you. Thank you.
China arrived calm and calculating, fully aware that its rise was no longer a prediction, it was a reality. And Africa entered with a confidence that shocked both, and the confidence of a continent finally in control of its resources, its markets, and its future. What followed was the unthinkable. The US offered a deal so unprecedented, so desperate, that analysts said it rewrote the laws of global power, a deal Washington would have never even whispered about just a decade ago.
We've got some clarity now for gold traders coming from the president, this in the form of a social media post, the president posting just a short time ago. A statement from Donald J. Trump, president of the United States of America: gold will not be tariffed. So that message from the president clearing up some confusion that we had late in the week last week after Customs and Border Protection issued some documents that people in the market believed indicated that gold bars would be tariffed, particularly coming out of Switzerland, and that caused...
But the world had changed, and Africa's rise had exposed weaknesses America could no longer hide. As global markets trembled and intelligence agencies went on high alert, one question spread across every major newsroom, every political office, every trading floor: why would the world's most powerful nation suddenly offer concessions to China and Africa at the same time? The answer was more shocking than anyone expected. And the fallout had only just begun.
And so for us, we hope to sign many of these in the days to come. But the first one we're going to sign is with Kenya. And the reason why is twofold. Number one, because of our close partnership. Number two, because they are they have stable and strong institutions, both in government and in the healthcare sector. And over the next few years, we're going to be investing $1.6 billion in health assistance over the next 5 years. And you'll see how that program works out. But the investment is in combination. It will allow us, first of all, to leverage.
As we celebrate progress in the DRC, we must not look away from other crises. I want to ask you respectfully, Mr. President, that in your quest for global peace, to support efforts to resolve the humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. I thank you.
By the time my first year ends, we're going to have over $20 trillion of investment coming into the United States. It's unheard of. We have AI factories. We're leading China by a lot. We have cars and car plants coming in by more than we've ever had built before. All of that would go away if we lose the tariff case. So all of it would go away. So they're not giving the right numbers. It would be an economic disaster. It would be a national security disaster if we lost the case in the Supreme Court.
The announcement stunned the world long before the details were understood. Whispers had echoed for weeks through diplomatic corridors, and leaked fragments of negotiations drifted through foreign ministries. But no one believed Washington would take such a desperate step. The U.S. had always projected confidence, control, dominance. Yet something had shifted deeply beneath the surface, and it became clear the nation was fighting to protect a global order that was slipping away. When the news broke that the U.S. had offered an unprecedented deal to both China and Africa simultaneously, analysts called it unthinkable, impossible, even humiliating. But the U.S. had its reasons it could no longer ignore. The economic storms of the past year had left Washington scrambling for stability. Inflation had clawed at living standards, aging infrastructure dragged down competitiveness, and once reliable industries had migrated toward more agile markets. While the U.S. fought to keep domestic manufacturing afloat, China had expanded its technological reach far beyond projections, and Africa had become the fastest-growing continental economy, linking energy, trade, and digital systems with a precision that caught every major power off guard. Africa was no longer the understudy of global development. It had become the world's next economic engine, driven not by imitation but by innovation, and China, instead of resisting Africa's rise, embraced it, fueling systems that bypassed Western gatekeeping entirely. The U.S. saw the writing on the wall, and so the unthinkable deal was born. It began in a closed room inside a heavily secured building in Washington where negotiators from the U.S. had gathered, studying intelligence reports spread across a long oval table. Each report carried the same pattern: China's accelerating technological momentum, Africa's explosive industrial growth, the weakening grip of U.S. influence in worldwide supply chains. Versions of the same question appeared in every file. What could the U.S. offer that would tie China and Africa back to the global network Washington had once controlled? The answer was clear but painful. The U.S. would have to surrender something it had never given up before: economic privileges that had long been untouchable. Washington knew that traditional alliances were no longer enough. Europe had become divided, Southeast Asia increasingly balanced its loyalties, and Middle Eastern states had shifted toward multipolar partnerships. Only China and Africa held the scale and velocity to alter the entire global system if they cemented their cooperation. Without American involvement, the world would move into a new era without asking Washington for permission or participation. And so the U.S. drafted an offer that stunned even its own advisors. China would gain unprecedented access to American infrastructure contracts, something no foreign power had ever been granted at such a level. It would also receive partial entry into U.S. energy markets, allowing Chinese companies to build, upgrade, and maintain systems previously guarded by strict national policies. In exchange, China would slow its expansion of certain trade corridors running through Central Asia and Eastern Europe, effectively reducing pressure on U.S. export routes. It was a bold attempt to pull China into interdependence instead of rivalry, but the Africa portion of the deal was even more shocking. The U.S. offered to eliminate tariffs on a massive selection of African goods, expand visa-free entry for business sectors, and grant African companies priority in bidding for several major U.S. green energy and digital infrastructure projects. It was the kind of partnership Africa had wanted for years, but one the U.S. had always resisted until it became too costly to ignore. Africa's Unified Economic Council saw the offer as an admission of weakness, though it was also an acknowledgement of Africa's unstoppable rise. In return, the U.S. asked Africa to slow the expansion of its continental currency project, which threatened to weaken the dollar's dominance in global transactions. It also requested that Africa limit China's exclusive control over its biggest industrial corridors, hoping to prevent a full-scale China-Africa geopolitical alignment that could permanently marginalize the West. China saw the U.S. offer as both a concession and an opportunity. Africa saw it as leverage, and together the two regions understood something the U.S. feared. For the first time in modern history, Washington needed them more than they needed Washington. The leaks that followed caused uproar worldwide, rumors of the U.S. offering land access for Chinese tech hubs spread across media outlets. Reports claimed the U.S. promised Africa special rights inside American maritime trade zones. None of the rumors were confirmed, but the speculation alone destabilized markets. Wall Street panicked. European governments demanded answers. Even allies in the Pacific questioned whether Washington had abandoned its traditional power strategy. Inside the U.S., political battles erupted instantly. Critics accused Washington of surrendering sovereignty. Supporters argued that global realities had changed and survival demanded cooperation over confrontation, but beyond the domestic chaos, China and Africa watched with calculated patience. They understood the value of waiting. The longer the U.S. struggled with internal conflict, the more leverage they gained when final negotiations began. What the world didn't know was that China and Africa had already formed a private channel to discuss the offer together. Their officials analyzed the U.S. proposal line by line, identifying pressure points Washington hoped would remain unseen. China understood that the U.S. feared its technological supremacy. Africa knew that Washington feared losing its last grip on global trade standards, and both recognized that accepting the deal would bind the U.S. economically to their rise in a way that could transform the global hierarchy. Still, neither China nor Africa rushed. They knew the U.S. needed urgency, they did not. That imbalance allowed them to shape the terms of the unfolding negotiation quietly, without showing desperation. And every hour they waited, Washington's position grew weaker. Analysts in Beijing predicted that the U.S. economy would shrink if the proposal failed. Economists in Africa argued that rejecting the deal would accelerate Africa's independence from Western markets entirely. When the first official meeting finally took place, the atmosphere was tense enough to silence the room. The US, China, and Africa sat across a polished table under the observation of a global press corps watching for any sign of collapse, but the real conversations, the ones that would shape the future, were still hidden behind walls. The unthinkable deal was in motion, and the world could only guess what its final form would become. The negotiations stretched late into the night, long after the cameras had been escorted out and the world was left to speculate. Inside the sealed room, the tension thickened as representatives from the US, China, and Africa attempted to shape an agreement that none of them fully trusted. Every sentence felt like a trap, every concession felt like a crack in national armor. The stakes were not simply economic. They were existential. China approached the talks with calm precision, confident in its growing global leverage. Africa entered with bold clarity, aware that its newfound economic power was reshaping global expectations. The U.S., however, walked into the room fighting shadows from every direction: domestic division, economic fragility, and a geopolitical landscape slipping out of its hands. The imbalance was undeniable. For the first time in decades, Washington was not dictating the rules. It was negotiating for relevance. Africa opened the floor by acknowledging that the U.S. deal was unprecedented, but questioned the sustainability of Washington's promises. Africa had been burned before by Western agreements that shifted with political winds, and this time Africa wanted guarantees, real ones, not statements that could be reversed with a future election or congressional vote. The U.S. insisted that the terms would be binding, attempting to reassure Africa that the deal was strategically essential, not politically optional. China watched silently, analyzing every weakness and hesitation in the U.S. position. China understood that Africa sought long-term security, not temporary partnership. In many ways, Africa's demands aligned more closely with Beijing's economic philosophy than Washington's. This presented the U.S. with a problem far larger than negotiations. Africa and China were beginning to think in synchronization, forming a unified vision that could eclipse the kind of influence the U.S. once enjoyed. Africa then posed the question that Washington feared most: what would prevent the U.S. from reverting to protectionist policies the moment its economy stabilized? What assurance existed that Africa's industries would not be cut off again once America regained leverage? The U.S. stumbled for an answer. China seized the opportunity, offering to act as a guarantor to ensure that all terms remained respected by every side. That single suggestion shifted the entire atmosphere of the negotiation. China positioning itself as a guarantor meant the U.S. would be forced to share authority, an idea Washington had avoided for decades. If China were to oversee American compliance with a global economic partnership, it would symbolize a historic power shift. Africa watched carefully, intrigued by the symbolism and strategy behind China's move. The U.S. pushed back immediately, insisting it needed no overseer. But China maintained its position with subtle force, noting that global trust in Washington's consistency had eroded due to 2 years of policy reversals across administrations. Africa did not disagree. The U.S. found itself cornered not by military might, not by economic sanctions, but by credibility, and credibility was something no nation could buy. Tension escalated as the hours stretched, with voices dropping lower and tempers tightening. Africa insisted that certain tariffs must vanish immediately, not gradually. China urged that American tech restrictions be loosened before further talks continued. The U.S. demanded concessions on Africa's growing continental currency project, arguing that its rapid development threatened global monetary stability, a diplomatic way of saying the dollar's dominance was slipping. Africa refused outright. The Continental currency was not negotiable, Africa explained. It was the foundation of its future independence. China quietly supported Africa's stance, understanding the long-term benefit of a diversified global financial landscape beyond the US dollar. Washington realized that both China and Africa were aligned on this issue and had no leverage to counter it. Hours passed with minimal progress until Africa introduced a proposal the US didn't expect. Africa suggested forming a Tri-continental economic council, one that would include Africa, China, and the US as equal partners in strategic development projects. The idea shocked the room. Such a council would mean the US accepting shared authority with two rising global powers. It would also mean China acknowledging the US as an indispensable partner despite their rivalry. Surprisingly, China didn't refuse the suggestion. Instead, Beijing asked for more details. Africa explained that global stability depended on balance, not dominance. The US needed access to Africa's markets. China needed global credibility. Africa needed both partners to avoid neocolonial behavior disguised as investment or influence. A shared council would act as a counterweight to unilateral control by any side. The US hesitated. Accepting equal partnership meant accepting a multipolar world officially, but rejecting the idea risked alienating Africa completely and pushing the continent deeper into China's sphere of influence. The US asked for time to consider the proposal. Neither China nor Africa pressured. They knew time was not Washington's ally. As negotiators stepped away for a recess, global markets continued to shift wildly. Reports leaked that rare mineral suppliers in Africa were preparing to redirect shipments toward China exclusively if the US refused key terms. American manufacturing firms issued warnings that supply shortages would trigger huge layoffs. European banks predicted significant financial rebalancing if Africa and China formalized their cooperation without Washington. Meanwhile, the U.S. media exploded with controversy. Some praised Washington for thinking creatively in a new global era. Others accused leaders of bowing to foreign powers. Protests erupted in several cities as citizens demanded clarity about what the U.S. was offering and why. The political divide grew sharper by the hour, weakening the U.S. position as the world watched. When negotiations resumed, the U.S. surprised everyone by agreeing to explore the Tri-continental Council proposal. Washington framed it as a strategic partnership, though Africa and China understood the deeper implications. The U.S. was acknowledging that the era of unilateral global power was over. With this shift, the mood softened slightly, though tensions still ran beneath the surface. Africa proposed that the first joint project of the Council focus on renewable energy infrastructure shared between the three partners. China supported the idea, knowing such a project would give it technological advantage while offering Africa long-term resilience. The U.S. agreed but demanded that data systems within the energy grid be jointly controlled to prevent any country from having unilateral digital access. This sparked another round of debate, but Africa intervened with a compromise that neither China nor the U.S. expected. Africa suggested creating a new neutral digital authority, independent of all three nations, to oversee the energy grid's data systems. Such an authority would ensure no country gained surveillance dominance. China hesitated, sensing limitations to its digital expansion. The U.S. hesitated, recognizing this would restrict future intelligence reach, but Africa held firm. If the world was to move forward, it could not be governed by suspicion and hidden agendas. Just before dawn, the three sides agreed to continue negotiations under the new framework. Nothing was final, but something had changed. The U.S. could no longer dictate global rules. China could not fully control Africa's future. Africa refused to be anyone's subordinate power. A new balance was emerging, and the unthinkable deal was turning into something far bigger than any of them anticipated.